Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's wonderful to see so many here and to hear such a buzz in the room, and with very good reason. Trobe University acknowledges the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional owners of the land on which we meet this evening, and we pay our respects to elders past and present. I'd like to add my acknowledgement and pay my respects to any members of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community who might be with us this evening. My name is Kerry Lee Krause, and I'm the Deputy Vice-Chancellor Academic at La Trobe University. And it is indeed my very great pleasure to welcome you to the fifth event in the Bold Thinking series for 2017. And as you would well know, this evening's presentation is entitled The La Trobe 3, Politics, Protests and Prison Life. It's a story that made headline news. Three young student activists, Brian Polar, Fergus Robinson and Barry York, ordered to be jailed indefinitely for disobeying a university order to stay off campus. Their defiance earned them a prison term in one of Melbourne's most notorious jails and set about a series of life-changing events. 45 years to the month since they were released from Pentridge Prison, this is the first time that the three men have agreed to speak on the circumstances that led to their incarceration and what has happened since. Tonight they'll be joined by respected La Trobe historian Professor Katie Holmes, who will explore the social and political context of that time and the broader cultural repercussions of the 70s student movement. So a little bit more about our panel this evening. As I mentioned, Professor Katie Holmes, she first came to La Trobe University in 1994. She teaches in the history department and for many years also taught in the Gender, Sexuality and Diversity program. Katie researches broadly in the 20th century Australian history, specialising in environmental history, gardens and women's private writings, especially in letters and diaries. Katie is the director of the Centre for the Study of the Inland, and she was the lead chief investigator on the Australian Research Council discovery project entitled Changing Landscapes, Changing People, Australia's Southern Mallee Lands, 1830 to 2012. She's also been a joint chief investigator on the La Trobe Monash University's linkage grant on Australian generations, life histories, generational change and Australian memory. Now, importantly, joining Katie this evening are indeed the La Trobe 3, starting first with Barry York. Barry was president on the La Trobe Labour Club in 1970 and 71. In 1972, Barry was jailed at Pentridge Maximum Security Prison with Fergus Robinson and Brian Polar for contempt of the Supreme Court. The jailing aroused widespread opposition, as there was no criminal charge, no right to appeal or bail, and no sentence. Barry recently retired from the Museum of Australian Democracy at Old Parliament House, where he worked as an historian. He has a PhD from the University of New South Wales, and in 2005 he was awarded the Order of Australia for his contribution to recording the Australian immigration story. And then we have Fergus Robinson. He has an MA Prelim in History from La Trobe University and a Diploma in Education. Together with Barry York, he co-authored the first published account of Aboriginal resistance to British settler colonialism, entitled The Black Resistance. Under the auspices of La Trobe University's History Department and the National Occupational Health and Safety Commission, he researched and wrote a history of occupational health and safety practices in the construction of the Snowy Mountains hydroelectric scheme. His particular academic interest, however, has been the Scottish Jacobite Rebellion of 1745 and 46. And thirdly, Brian Polar. At 18, Brian was called for national service in the army, which was deferred as he began his studies at La Trobe in 1969. In 1971, he was elected President of the Student Representative Council, and he participated in student sit-ins and occupations. As a result, he was excluded for 1 year in 1972. In March 1972, injunctions were taken out against 4 excluded students, including Brian Poehler. Warrants were issued for their arrest, with Brian on the run from police until May, when the Special Branch arrested him at home in Nil. He was sent to Pentridge Prison for 3 months because he refused to apologise and believes he had nothing to apologise for. Since 1972, Brian Poehler has been a teacher, lecturer, writer, and community activist, and he's still a communist. I'll now hand over to tonight's host. Importantly, very importantly, our host is broadcaster, journalist, very well-known writer, Francis Leach, and of course the panel. Please join me in welcoming them.
Thank you. Thank you, Deputy Vice-Chancellor. And it feels like a school reunion, that's what it feels, which is amazing. It's wonderful to be here, to be part of telling this extraordinary story and trying to learn a little from it. So let's jump straight into it. Take me back to La Trobe University in 1972, Barry. Paint a picture for me, describe it. What was it like to be there?
I think to understand 1972, of course, you've got to look at the preceding years that were really more active and more militant. I think 1972 was actually a downturning point where a whole lot of new students were admitted. The university was expanding greatly, you know, and a lot of those who came in as freshers that year weren't familiar with the continuum that led to our struggle in 1972. That continuum began, I think, in 1969 with the when we escorted representatives of the Defence Department off the campus who were recruiting on the campus. But generally, that period is hard to describe to people who weren't part of it, because it was like living and breathing politics and actually believing that we were approaching a revolutionary moment because we were part of a global movement, be it in America or UK, Europe, China with the Cultural Revolution, all these young people rising up, challenging authority, challenging the received wisdom, and basically embracing, as I did, the Maoist dictum, it is right to rebel.
Were you, Fergus, politically aware before you came to La Trobe, or was La Trobe an awakening for you?
My father was a Labor Party supporter and he had a strong attachment to Labor politics, but I was from a middle-class background. I went to a private school, Ivanhoe Grammar. When I came onto campus, La Trobe was a disappointment for me. I would have liked to have gone to Melbourne University and I would have liked to have done law, but that wasn't going to be the case. Here I was on a campus of paddocks and about 4 or 5 buildings, the rest, and a number of buildings under construction. In summer was covered with daisies, mud in winter, and a moat ran through the middle. As a first-year student, I got involved in activities. I played football with the football club. I did intervarsity skiing, intervarsity athletics. I was a pretty normal sort of student. But I still had a predilection for left-wing politics, and probably what affected me more than anything else was the uprising in France in 1968. That was probably a pivotal moment, and it kind of changed the way I saw things. Capitalism, I think, had done a very poor job of recruiting people in the corporate sense to its ranks in those days. Capitalism was very unsophisticated, not like now where you see the glamorous advertising and the corporatisation of all aspects of life. Then it was very crude. And what we were looking forward to as young people were to become teachers in a very mundane sort of society. And the Paris uprising was exciting. And for us, for me particularly, it was an opportunity to embrace a creative desire to change the world. And I became radicalised through that event and it was not only France, it was in Germany and Italy too. And of course, at the background was the Vietnam War and the opposition to conscription. And I think because La Trobe was such a bland institution when I first arrived, the left really provided some colour, some interest. It provided a dynamic to the university. It gave the students some sort of life beyond, because it was a very conservative place at La Trobe. They had colleges. We had to wear gowns if we had a meal at Glen Dining Hall. They really thought they were going to have an Oxford-type university in their books, and this wasn't going to be the case. And the left really provided an alternative life.
Brian, it was very personal for you because you got a deferment from National Service and had that encounter with the Defence Department as a young person. Was that the key to your political awakening?
Well, not really, because my radicalisation actually began at St Patrick's College in Ballarat, where I was boarding, when I was asked to join the cadets, and that was in 1965. And I refused to join the cadets because I saw the cadets as a training force for the war in Vietnam. So my radicalisation actually began in my senior years at boarding school. And whilst there, of course, in that Catholic tradition of social justice, as Barry and Ferg have outlined, I think I certainly came into La Trobe University in '69 with a very strong sense of what is right and what is wrong.
So a strong moral compass.
A very strong, I don't like to use the word moral because that's got religious overtones, but ethics, very strong sense of ethics. And the war in Vietnam, and you mentioned being called up, I was deferred, but when I was excluded from the university with Barry and Fergus in 1971 for the academic year 1972, the administration of the university contacted the Commonwealth Police to dob me in. So when I was inside in Pentridge, I received a call-up notice to attend a medical, and of course I was in Pentridge on not only the Supreme Court injunction, but on besetting premises as well, which was an act brought in by Hangman Sir Henry Bolte, and to stop students from occupying buildings. But the letter for me to attend the medical was addressed to Brian Polar, 15 Church Street, Horsham. And fortunately, everyone, I was up before Dismissal Smith. And Dismissal Smith was notorious for dismissing a case on the slightest bit of evidence. And so that was case dismissed. And they took me back to Pentridge.
Straight back to Pentridge. Katie, give us a sense of how the university was changed by circumstance, because around the time that these guys were turning up at university, a free education via the Whitlam government had become part of the reality of young people who previously had no expectation of going to university, working class kids who had no access previously other than through scholarship. How did that change the nature of politics on campus, that working class influx, in conjunction with the events of the time?
Well, actually, Whitlam's free education wasn't introduced until after these guys had all been arrested. So, in fact, the period that was so formative for them was prior to free education. But under the Menzies government and subsequent Conservative governments, increasing numbers of students had won studentships, and I think Barry had a studentship, and many of those were kind of indentured in that you did your studentship and then you had to teach usually for a number of years. So there were influx of young a larger number of young students entering universities across, not just Australia, but across the Western world, really. And they're a baby boomer generation. They've come, usually, even if working class, from a greater affluence than most of their parents would have had when they were growing up. So they have different expectations, they've got a different sense of who they are. And in particular in Monash and La Trobe, the radical nature of the student movement really shaped those early years. In terms of their impact on La Trobe, because La Trobe was founded right at the sort of centre of these times, it was 1967 obviously that La Trobe is founded. 1966 had been the year when L.B. Johnson had visited Australia. It was also the year that marked the death of the first Australian conscript to Vietnam. So things are really, everyone is on a kind of heightened political edge. And because the university, for the students, the university kind of represented a form of authority, and authority to which, as Brian's just pointed out, could act against their best interests very clearly, then they were an oppositional force.
I'm really interested in something you told me, Fergus, before we get to the circumstance of your confrontation with the university. You were really keen for me to ask you about the difference between the counterculture of the 60s and the sort of activity that you were involved in and the activism that you were involved in on campus that led you to being jailed. What do you see is the difference, and why is it important that people understand that it is different?
Well, I think in the popular mythology of the period, everything's thrown in together under the term the counterculture. So the image of the protest movement is one of hippies, it's one of dropping out, it's one of smoking marijuana, and this is the image that people have of the radical movement of the time. Now, it just wasn't like that at all. Certainly there were people who were hippies. Certainly marijuana was smoked on campus. I never smoked. I never smoked at university. And I doubt if Barry smoked. I won't say I don't know if Brian
Guilty, Your Honour.
But we identified with the Black Panthers in America. The Black Panthers in America had very disciplined attitudes to taking drugs because they knew the FBI was pushing heroin into the ghettos. So when you look at the movement, we weren't alternative in that hippie sense. Most of the people who joined our ranks were ordinary students. There wasn't a sense that these were hippies or people were wearing caftans, and the particular groups we were involved with, they were ordinary students who became politicised. And this was the character. Now, within the broader group of students, of course, the people who attended moratoriums, there were people who were, I suppose you could loosely call them hippies and part of the counterculture. But we don't like to be identified with the counterculture as such. I mean, during my time at university, and I'm not the only one, I worked on building sites, I worked in factories. We reached out to the workers. We developed community links with the people in West Heidelberg. We had strong links with the Waterside Workers Union and the Builders Labourers Federation. We wanted to be as normal as possible, but in some ways we weren't, of course. I mean, it wasn't normal to have revolutionary views. It wasn't normal to believe that the state should be overthrown and we established socialism. But in our daily lives, we wanted to integrate and be part of what the people were doing. So this idea of the counterculture and the left has to be sorted out. Our particular model and our particular involvement wasn't one of sort of hedonism. It was very serious.
Can I make a point? I agree broadly with what Fergus said. I must say, as a 66-year-old looking back, part of me actually regrets that I didn't smoke marijuana back then. Because if you're going to smoke, if there was ever a time, I mean, I believe that was the time to smoke it. But I wrote a book called Student Revolt that was about La Trobe and the sources of student unrest in Australia at that period. It was published in 1989. It's available free online at my blog, 21st Century Left. But I wrote it. I was very committed to writing it, precisely for the reason Fergus points out, that, you know, the popular cultural image of that period was focusing almost entirely on the countercultural element and not the political dynamic that really drove it. Perhaps I disagree slightly with Fergus in that when I look back, I think the hippie-type people, the counterculturalists, they were with us. You know, they were allies. They were on the demonstrations and in the occupations, but they would probably see as a heavy political dimension hasn't been acknowledged adequately. We were serious, in other words, and that's why we ended up in jail.
You were serious, and that's why, as you say, Barry, you obviously were identified as a threat, but how did you get serious? What sort of things did you start to do, Brian, on campus that caught the eye of the Trobe University authorities that sort of picked you out as going, oh God, these guys are troublemakers? Tell us about the first actions you took.
Well, in '69, I arrived there. Action really started in, I think, '68, when students were objecting to the presence of Defence Force recruiting personnel and also the presence of Nationwide Food Services on campus, which is an American multinational which was servicing the troops in Vietnam. And it's the connection that radicalised students, not just Maoists. Fergus and Barry were more aligned with Maoism than I was, but I was influenced by it. I think it's a very. I think all this counterculture and the New Left. I think it's quite a complex area of study, which probably needs more study. I think, Katie.
Thanks.
I think. I think. The counterculture was political, the personal was political, and I don't think hippies, so-called, should be dismissed as just potheads. I think they were deeply, they had a deep political culture. They were anti-authoritarian, and fair enough, they might be living in their nice big houses as baby boomers now in 2017. But at that time, they were genuinely fired up, radical students, and ideologically and philosophically driven. And they'd done their reading. They'd done their reading coming from conservative schools, be it St Pat's College in Ballarat or Ivanhoe Grammar. As soon as they got to university, as soon as we got to university, many of you here now are our contemporaries. We studied existentialism, we studied Marx, and we loved it. It was a political and philosophical paradigm that was contradistinctive to the paradigm that we'd all been brought up in the previous 18 years of our lives, and that's fundamentally what drove the radical impetus.
But when did the idea become action? When did you start taking action that started to upset and alarm those who were in charge of the university? Do you remember the first actions you took?
Well, I went to La Trobe in 1969, my first year. I had no idea whether I would get into university. I got in by one subject. I come from a very working class migrant background. I grew up in Brunswick. My dad was a factory worker, and I recall, you know, in that time when you do your matric or your HSC and you're waiting for the results, will I get enough to get into university? My dad, we got on the tram, we never had a car, we went down to Fitzroy and this big warehouse, and my dad introduced me to the boss, and the guy said, look, if you don't get into uni, come here to work as a wool sorter. And he showed me all the different types of big bales of wool, and I could easily have ended up a wool sorter, and I'm sure I would have helped create great disorder under heaven in the wool industry if that happened. But But to me, in 1969, it was that issue of Defence Department officials recruiting through the Careers and Appointment Service on the campus. And there was an obvious connection there with the Vietnam War, which people like myself, I could say I was anti-war, but I have always tried to point out, especially to the ABC, I wasn't anti-war. I was a hawk, but on the side of the Vietnamese people in their struggle. I wanted them to win, and I wasn't a peacenik, so to speak. And when we speak of, that we escorted the Defence Department officials off the campus, we weren't Guevarists, a little band of revolutionaries acting on behalf of the people. All of the actions began with general meetings of students, either called by the SRC or by the Labour Club, run in accord with Westminster rules of debate and followed by decisions as to whether we would evict the Defence Department. We had meetings of 1,000 people on 3 or 4 occasions in a campus of 2,000 to 3,000 people. And it interests me on reflection how those who opposed us, who are aligned with the National Civic Council and Santa Maria and the Conservative right, were never willing to accept the democratic vote of students, and later actually went to the Supreme Court to try to overturn decisions democratically made about the SRC paying student fines. So for me, it began really 1969, evicting the Defence Department people.
And then the protests started, and you tell me, Fergus, about one protest up Waterdale Road towards the university when you started to... It started to get heavy with the police presence and Special Branch, and they weren't mucking around anymore. Tell people about that.
Look, it was an interesting exercise because I'd been involved in a lot of sit-ins in government buildings, anti-conscription sit-ins, and I was attracted to Barry's group, they were the Communist Club, but I was accusing them of all talk and no action, and I can see my friend Rob Bennett's in the room here, suggested that we should have a march down Waterdale Road. He wanted to show that we were prepared to do something. We'd have a march from Ivanhoe to the university, and we'd we'd obviously, raise the issues of anti-Vietnam protest to the local people. And this march of 70 students, when it got down to the factory belt, or just before the factory belt at Doherty's Road, Special Branch Police had driven vehicles right across the middle of the road and came out with batons and attacked us, completely unprovoked. And we had to flee in all directions. I remember myself, and I'm sure it happened to the other students, we were hid inside people's homes. And after that particular protest, it became a cause célèbre in the university, and we organised a bigger march. And it was from Waterdale Road, from Northland Shopping Centre to La Trobe University. And the police had established an ambush for us in the factory belt near a place called Orthla Panels. And the police came out with batons and they just ruthlessly and violently attacked the demonstration. And this was a unifying action for students right across the whole political spectrum.
So the more they had a go at you, the more people were attracted.
And then we had a third march, this time with 1,000 builders, labourers, waterside workers, students from other universities attended. And the police tried to push us off the road, but we wouldn't let them, and we won the day. They even had horses at Waterdale Road, if you can believe that. Even the police brought their horses. So this was a major radicalising event for the whole campus.
Just on that, Katie, the history of the time, the Bolte government, was there a sense of alarm now that these protests were growing? Was that the tipping point as to when the government, the university decided it was going to take this extraordinary step?
I think the tipping point started to come actually when the students stormed, the administration buildings and tried to get into council meetings. And from the students' point of view, that was about wanting there to be greater transparency about the actions of the university, and also grave concern about the role of the then Chancellor, Archibald Glenn, who also happened to be the chairman of ICI, Imperial Chemical Industries, which was implicated in the chemical bombing of Vietnam. So from the students' point of view, this Chancellor was completely the wrong person to be the Chancellor of La Trobe University. And so there was, as I understand it, there was a series of council meetings and other administrative meetings that the students tried to attend, and it was on the basis of those that the university began to get increasingly concerned about their actions and to then seek to ban the 4 leaders from the campus and take out a Supreme Court injunction.
The Supreme Court injunction is important for people to understand, because the first question that sprung to my mind is, how could a university, in conjunction with the police or with authorities, put you in jail without trial and without any charge? So it's the writ of attachment, which is an ancient, well, not ancient, but it's an old law. It's a medieval law. Explain to Barry what that was and how it functioned.
I will, but can I just pick up on something Katie said? We never argued that Archibald Glenn and ICI were involved in chemical bombing. We had evidence of a contract with through the Department of Supply to the Australian Army in Vietnam. But the other big issue at the time, the second biggest issue after Vietnam, was definitely our solidarity with the people of South Africa in the struggle against apartheid. And Archibald Glenn, our Chancellor, he also sat on the board of the parent group, Imperial Chemicals Industries, and they were active in South Africa. And again, we couldn't find out exactly how, but the nature of what they produced would suggest explosives, munitions, and so on. But it didn't really matter. The fact he was a symbol of the capitalism and the role of the university that we were out to overturn. Now, regarding the writ of attachment in 1972, we were expelled in 1971 as a result of sitting in the admin building. We were disruptive. We weren't violent. I deny that we were violent. The sit-ins go back to the student non-violent movement of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in America. It's not a violent action per se. On one occasion, we blockaded the council members, again, after a general meeting was called and voted to do it. And we were then hauled before what is called a proctorial board, which is a domestic tribunal set up under subordinate legislation, so there's no sense of natural justice having to be followed, and it definitely wasn't. The SRC and a huge general meeting, again of about 1,000 students, recognised us. They said, no, we don't accept the expulsions that you have suffered. They're unfair. As far as we're concerned, you're still students. So we returned to the campus, continuing to agitate and to lead. And the fact that the injunction that was sought against us specified that we were not to set foot upon the premises known as La Trobe University suggests that they were out to stop us having a say, having an input, influencing the student body. They had lost the debate of ideas, and we had already won, because in December 1971, halfway through his term as Chancellor, Archibald Glenn announced that he was standing down. The other issue was an exclusions clause that applied a non-academic criteria on people applying for admission. A committee was set up and it went our way. We won that as well, so that only academic criteria applied to people being admitted. The writ of attachment was the method used when a court injunction is breached. The sheriff or deputy sheriff has to read out the writ, and the police are usually with him, as they were in my case, otherwise I would have run away, but 2 carloads of police with the sheriff. The writ of attachment is read out and you're lodged in jail.
Until what?
Until such time as you purge your contempt, which means more than apologising to the court. It wasn't just about saying, oh, sorry, Gov. It was, it means promising to abide by the terms of the restraining order. The writ of attachment goes back to medieval times when the sheriff of Nottingham would, you know, some peasants hadn't paid their
Tithe.
due to the big landlord, and they'd just be seized, dumped in a prison until such time as they came up with what they owed the poor landlord.
So the writ of attachment has been issued. When were you arrested and how?
The writ of attachment, I think about February 72, something like that. I was on the run from the police up in Walhalla Woods Point for a couple of months. Been smuggled in and out of the university in cars, safe houses. It was, some people may think that's sort of daring do, and but it was actually quite scary. I'd like to comment on the nature of La Trobe University. I think it was basically a working class university, and it's sited in the northern suburbs. And on the University Council, we had august personages such as Sir Archibald Glenn, who was on the Scotch College Board, on the board of Ormond College, a top Presbyterian in town, Melbourne Club. And if you look at, go through the names of who was on the council at that time, Buchan springs to mind. There's about a dozen of them, men, all men, who are from the Melbourne Club establishment, Naval and Military Club, the top private schools, no St Pat's College there or Ivanhoe Grammar. I mean, seriously top, like Scotch and Geelong Grammar. So that situation, and plus a retired Brigadier General, I think he was, Tim Taylor, as the registrar. So we basically had on campus a military industrial complex running the bloody university and the academics. So something really had to give, because it was a deep cultural divide between working class students and staff, by and large, who are empathetic with the students and anti-Vietnam War and anti-national service, against a university council who was pro-Vietnam War, indeed servicing and profiting from that war, and also hand in glove with the Bob Santamaria's National Civic Council. And a friend of mine, Sandy Dool, has just told me that Mark Aarons has just put out a book last month on The Show, which is actually the National Civic Council's account of things. And what a proper bastard Bob Santamaria was. And today, this afternoon, before coming down here, I had a look at the printout that was placed into now Cardinal George Pell's hand when I was teaching some years later in the 70s at St Patrick's College, because I couldn't get a job anywhere else, right? And George gave me a printout of how the National Civic Council, together with ASIA, had followed me around into gay bar, because I was gay, still am. And, the drugs, prison, member of the Communist Party of Australia, who my friends were, the political background to when I ran against Ian MacDonald, who's now doing time in New South Wales, sadly, but sad for Ian. But you reap what you sow. So all of these things, and what a nasty outfit the National Civic Council were to hound non-violent students who were pro-peace, who were communist and socialist in the very purest sense of that word. So I'll close up there for a while.
We have got a time issue. I do want to get to the heart of the narrative and tell the story, then ask a few questions. You were arrested?
Yeah,
Fergus?
I was the first arrested. I was at Heidelberg Court facing charges of dangerous driving and throwing a rock to the danger of. Police had chased me, detectives had chased me to interview me on events on campus, and we had a car chase. And after the court case, I didn't plead at the time, and I was charged with dangerous driving, and I was sentenced to 3 months jail.
On that charge?
On that charge, plus losing my licence, plus $500 fine. As I walked out of the court, the Supreme Court Sheriff arrested me. So I was taken by the Supreme Court Sheriff. What had happened, a member of the university administration had made a sworn affidavit that I'd been on campus. That was produced to the Supreme Court, and that was sufficient to issue the writ of attachment. And I was taken straight to Pentridge, to the remand section, strip searched, went through the same processes as the other prisoners, and put into a small cell opposite the condemned, the hanging beam, the execution dock. And I spent 2 weeks there in
Delightful,
remand
delightful.
before I was classified into A division. But the writ of attachment, as Barry said, has its origins in sort of medieval England. And when our barrister was arguing our case, because we did have challenges to the injunctions, a man called John Little, an excellent barrister, a fine person, he drew his source from the Magna Carta. He described our jailing as cruel and unusual punishment, a violation of human rights. He did his best. Of course, it carried no weight because they were determined to keep us in there.
So they were determined to keep you in there, but I'm interested in how you three decided, or how you came to a decision together to have a sense of solidarity to continue to refuse to yield.
It was impossible not to. I mean, we were committed to the struggle. There's no way I would have stayed in there forever. I wouldn't have apologised. There was no way. And I knew that Brian and Barry were exactly the same.
So you didn't have to have that conversation, you just knew?
We just knew it was integral to who we were. Look, even though I can be very critical of the university administration, and I believe they behaved badly, they were faced with a formidable enemy at the time from their point of view. During our occupation of the administration building, we went through all their filing cabinets. We came across a lot of dirt on them. They'd planned to station the armed forces on campus. So it was serious business from the university administration's point of view. The fact that they overreacted and probably didn't realise that in times to come these young men would probably not be hardened revolutionaries, that's another story. They did overreact and they acted badly towards us. But their conception at the time was that they were faced with a real threat. And we, on our part, were determined to fight them.
Life inside prison, Barry? What are your enduring memories of your first sort of few days, for instance, just adapting to being inside Pentridge?
Well, I was in the remand section for the first few days before going to A division, where Fergus and Brian, who had already been captured, were imprisoned. A division was the section for long-term people, like people in for murder, recidivists, bank robbers. that was a bit demoralising because it suggested they thought we were going to be in for a very long time, you know. But it was interesting in remand or D division, you know, you'd see the guys who were on death row. We still had the death penalty. You'd see the cages over in, and you would see the hanging contraption, right, Fergus, Brian? You know, we'd walk to the remand yards, go past that. That's a memory, but the stupidity of a 19th century jail, maximum security jail, in the mid-20th century or late 20th century, that was my overwhelming feeling that this was just... Henry Lawson wrote a poem, 103, about a prisoner whose cell was 103, and he says, if the public knew what the prisoners know and felt as the prisoners feel, if the public knew, they would storm their jails like they stormed the old Bastille. And so when we got out, the first thing I did, I'd smuggled out a letter from a bloke who'd done time in H Division, which was Hell Division, the punishment section. And I think the three of us got very involved with the Prisoners Action Committee. And I was involved in that for some years because the whole system was 19th century, counterproductive, no real rehabilitation. And the routines, I think, would be pretty similar to what they'd been in the 1850s and 60s. And you heard violence. I would wake up in A Division in my single cell. We were sort of in solitary confinement for 18 hours each day, I think it was, or 16 hours each day. And you would hear through the night the guys in H Division being beaten up. Terrible thing, you know, to hear them screaming and to hear thuds and to be fair, that they weren't angels. They would abuse the prison officers and say things about their wives and what have you. But the jail, for me, just the experience made me think, oh, this has got to change, like this is in no one's interests, you know.
I want to speak one incident that happened. A prisoner in B Division, an old man died overnight. He cried out for help and warders didn't come to his assistance. And the word got round the whole prison about the death of this man. So we had a meeting in A Division and we...
So you're organising in there as well?
Yeah. And we decided we'd go out on strike. Now, the prisoners were concerned because we had to work during the day. I had to carry the laundry around the jail, pulling this cart. Barry would be cleaning the tiers. Brian was probably doing the same. And we had this meeting to have a strike. Prisoners knew, the warders decided that they would keep us in our cells, so they locked us in for a whole day. When they opened the cells the next day, they were lined up on the tiers, out of uniform with baseball bats. And they were telling us, one false move and you're all going to get it. This is what prison was like. And you were very much aware that you had no rights. We used to hear the H Division prisoners, they'd be breaking rocks. People probably don't believe this. Their lives were spent with a 16-pound hammer smashing bluestone boulders into the size of their fists and then breaking them down with a small hammer to the size of their thumbnail. And you do this clink, clink, clink all day. 2 prisoners back to back with a shit bucket and overseen by warders. And this was the reality. This was the state of prisons in Victoria at this time. And for me, it was a very profound experience because I learnt what it was like to be oppressed. I learnt what it was like to be part of a group of people who had no rights, who were living in the worst kind of situation.
So in a way, did it reinforce your political belief? Because it
certainly did. But it probably had a deeper philosophical impact on me. I could never become part of the system. I would never conform. I could never rejoin the ranks of the establishment coming from a private school. I could never go back. That experience was going to be with me. It was going to be a big chip on my shoulder for the rest of my life.
I need to ask, Brian, how much personal damage did it do having to go through this experience? And how long, or does it still stay with you?
Well, it did me enormous. It was 45 years ago, virtually to the month, really, when we were released. But it's done me enormous personal, psychological damage, because I was assaulted in D Division one night in a 6-out cell when I got back from another abortive appearance before a Supreme Court judge with no apology. So that scarred me very, very deeply. Another thing that one day towards the end of our stay in there was a demonstration of several hundred unionists and students banging on the gates, big iron gates of A Division, and those gates were almost going to come down. They weren't the main gates, and they weren't highly secured gates, and they could well have come down. And a warder standing next to me said, "Those gates," I'm sorry, Katie, those gates come down, you, I'm going to shoot you. And that happened. So the damage, I don't know, I can't speak for Ferguson Barry, but the damage to me personally, physically, psychologically, in terms of my employment, that I couldn't get a bloody job. No one had,
I think that was the
you know,
case for
it was
everyone
just,
here.
during and after the imprisonment, it was terrible. But, and I have to say this, you asked the question, what kept Barry, Fergus and I together there? One day, Ted Hill, the Secretary of the Communist Party of Australia, Marxist-Leninist. Now, I wasn't a Maoist, but I was, particularly after Chairman Mao's comments about homosexuality being a bourgeois Western complaint. How could I belong to such a philosophy? Ted Hill came in and laid it on the line and said, are you going to stick it out? Are you tough enough, basically, he said to us, didn't he, to keep going on? And I thought, shit, can I keep going on with this? I knew all I had to do was apologise, and I thought, no, because the issue was justice, political justice for students, the links with the Vietnam War, national service, student rights, and my beliefs, my philosophy as a communist, and plus basically comradely loyalty to my two friends and comrades, Fergus and Barry. So that was that. So we stuck it out. We stayed.
You did. And Katie, what was just to give us the history of this, what was the moment, or what was the circuit breaker that saw these guys released?
It's a good question. I think there was negotiation with the university, and the university effectively backed down and withdrew their insistence that you apologise.
Essentially what happened was that, as I said at the beginning, 1972 was a sort of decline because the combat troops of Australia had been withdrawn. All these new students weren't part of our revolutionary movement, weren't aware of the preceding 3 or 4 years of struggle, and to them it was like there's just disruption, and we didn't get much support from them. So we had to work out what's an appropriate strategy under those circumstances. I hadn't been captured yet, and we came up with the proposal that there be a referendum. Again, this is the democratic nature of our movement. We said let there be an SRC-run referendum of the whole student body to decide the issues. Do they want injunctions to stay on us and on SRC funds? That's another issue. Do they want any civil proceedings or criminal proceedings to continue or not? And I think, and the only condition we put on it was, we said this is the way we want to go, and we will accept what the student body decides in the referendum as long as the University Council agrees to do the same, which they weren't prepared to do. 1,600 students voted, and I think 1,100 voted to get rid of all injunctions and to stop any further criminal or civil proceedings against the radicals. It was another victory for us. Eventually, like, I don't know, a month and a half later, with that moral force at work and continuing pressure, especially from the legal profession, who weren't happy with this use of the contempt provision for political purposes, the Vice-Chancellor came to see us, Dr. Myers, and to cut a long story short, he said, look, if you guys sign a statement promising not to, renouncing violence on the campus, we will move in the Supreme Court for your release. And we thought about it, thought, now hold on, we deny that we've been a violent movement. Violence happened, but we would deny that we were violent. So we said, let us think about it. We thought about it. He came back to see us in Pentridge, and thanks to some sound legal advice, we put it to him, we will sign it if you sign it on behalf of the university authorities. And he was a bit perplexed by this, but then we said, well, you know, he thought about it and came back to us and agreed to sign it. So this statement that a certain right-wing conservative public commentator recently said was us signing a statement renouncing violence was no such thing. It was us joining with the Vice-Chancellor and the University Council in renouncing violence on the campus. And through signing that with the Vice-Chancellor, we opened the way to the authorities approaching the Supreme Court and saying it's been resolved. And we were released on August the 4th.
And that was our victory, really, to have the university join with us in a non-violent action, because to our mind, it was the university that had been violent, not us, and we weren't violent. There's no greater act of violence than to incarcerate people in a prison, except murder itself.
We're going to throw the floor open to questions in a moment. I just need to ask a couple of questions before we do that. Was it worth it, Fergus? Given everything that had happened to you, and when you look at what's happened in your life since, was it worth it?
Look, I have no regrets whatsoever. The time, the place, the cause, everything was predicated on that, and I believed I had to behave the way I did, and I don't regret it. It hasn't done me great service in life.
You also found it hard to get a job?
Look, I found it hard to get... I worked at Ford for 6 years in a factory, and I carried out my convictions to work with the working class. During that time, I've only learnt since, ASIO was in contact with the Industrial Relations Department at Ford, and they were constantly finding ways to seek my dismissal. I was a senior shop steward, and I had a lot of battles and struggles at Ford during those days. But I don't have any regrets. It's funny, there's a kind of a saying, and I don't take this literally. It's a saying that says, a man's not a man if he's not a communist by the age of 21. the other half, of course, he's a fool if he's a communist after the age of 30. And I think there's a kind of an element of truth to the first part. There are people who should have been involved in our struggle who weren't. There were people who became prominent people in the trade union movement who didn't lift a finger at La Trobe. Now, I'm not going to talk about names because I don't want to denigrate people, but there were people who protected themselves, and I'm proud that I wasn't one of them.
Barry, just to finish on that, did you ever want an apology from the university? Do you think you owed one? Would it matter?
To be honest, I think political apologies are a load of bull. If the institution offering an apology is responsible for what happened, then there should be compensation. If there's no compensation, it's just hot air. And yes, I think at my workplace I was the only person not to be oohing and ahhing about Kevin Rudd's apology to Aboriginal people for exactly that same reason. But I think apologies are crap, basically, and so I had no interest in seeking an apology, and I still think universities are state-funded institutions of propaganda that perpetuate bourgeois ideology, even though they're now more technocratic managerial than run by overt capitalists.
And just to finish, Brian, can you believe now if you go to Pentridge, you better go with your chequebook because they now have subdivided and sold that place, and it is a very desirable inner city location.
It's all little houses on the hillside
Can
now.
you imagine how people
Yes.
live on that space?
Yes. Well, it'd be interesting to have a little domicile there, I suppose. But no, I don't fancy it,
Didn't think you
Francis.
would.
No. I don't know. I think probably. Do you want to move to questions?
Yeah, I think we should move to some questions. We are short of time, so if you do have a question, introduce yourself and make your question succinct and direct it to the stage, and we'll try to get through as many as possible. We've got somebody standing up.
My name is Carl Armstrong, and this is relevant to what was made by Barry a second ago. A few years ago, one of my cousins invited me to make a presentation at Genazzano Girls' College in Kew on my role against the Vietnam War, my detention in Pentridge and my time spent in China and Albania. And I would like to ask Barry York and the others too perhaps, how they would answer this question today that my niece Emma put to me at the end of my talk. Are you still a revolutionary and Maoist? My honest answer to her and her class was, in view of the huge cost in human lives and lack of human rights and what else occurred in China and Albania, it was a resounding no. Any comments?
No, we'll let Barry respond. Fergus, do you want Fergus, then you go.
Okay.
Look, I sympathise with what Carl's saying. I'm not a communist anymore. I have strong views, ethical views about social justice. I think it's very difficult to overthrow the capitalist system. The problems the Bolshevik regime experienced in Russia and the crimes that have been attributed to Stalin, it goes back to the difficulty it is for the people to take over wealth and manage it for themselves. The capitalists will never let go, and the atrocities that have occurred in countries that have been nominally socialists have been largely a product of this. And I've learned one thing in life: you've got to be very careful for what you wish for. At the time, I was very committed to socialist revolution, but by God, if we'd fought a proper struggle, there would have been a lot of people killed. And I have a strong sense of the importance of the individual, and I think you can't go into these struggles lightly. At the time, we were young, but as soon as I had children, it started to affect me. My love, my agape love of mankind, suddenly was centred on these two little children I had to look after. I had to think about their future. I had to think of what happened in Chile at the time of the military coup, when people were herded into Santiago Stadium and mowed down. It's very difficult to overthrow a system, and particularly the capitalist system. And I can understand what Carl said. The events that happened in Cambodia were very disillusioning for me with the Red Khmer Rouge, and I think some of the things that happened in China. The other thing I believe is that the good die young. The people who end up as the leaders in many of these regimes have protected themselves, and they become corrupted. And I think the people who fight on the barricades, the people who fight in the paddy fields, they're the ones who've given their lives, but often the leaders become rich from the spoils. And I think that's a tragedy of all revolutions.
Barry, have you maintained your political conviction as it stands?
I think I understand politics much better now than I did back then, because we were largely motivated by a moral kind of sense rather than the proper study of what we claimed to be, which was Marxist. My views are set out pretty much on my blog, 21st Century Left, spelt with a C, 21 left. I never studied economics, always found it too hard. Yet revolutionary socialism is economics. That's what Marx, Engels and Lenin said anyway, and I think they were right. I'm fortunate to have a comrade here today, David McMullen, who is an economist, who's published a document called Rescuing the Message of the Communist Manifesto, the Revolutionary Role of Capitalism, that takes a pretty orthodox Marxist view that reflects my opinion as well. And if you Google Rescuing the Message of the Communist Manifesto or go to my website, you'll find it there. I call myself a revolutionary Democrat. I love the way the people are fighting tyranny in places like Syria. Just as I supported the Vietnamese and the South African people, I support the Syrian people in their democratic revolution against a fascist regime. I could go on. There are no communist governments that I would be safe with. I would end up in jail in Cuba, North Korea, and any others you want to name.
We've got some other questions.
But can we ask... Dan?
Hi. There was always a difference between the Latrobe Maoists and the Monash Maoists, but I'd like to bring you to the present and find out whether there's a difference on this. That to me, a big part of what happened in the 60s was the total repudiation of what passed for a left in the 50s. That they called themselves the Communist Party, we called them the Revisionists. Now today, I reckon we've got a pretty similar situation, but the revolutionary left hasn't started up again yet. We've got people who are considered the left in Australia who would have been run out of town if they turned up at either Monash or Latrobe, in my view. I understand the differences between Brian and Barry's perspective on the hippies and Fergus's, and I'd take a mixture of the two in some ways, but the hippies are nothing compared with the Greens. Right, the hippies were part of the struggle over Vietnam that was the main struggle of the era.
Have we got a question?
Whereas the modern left, my question is, for the fellow leftists from Latrobe, do you share the perspective of this Monash Maoist, who's still a revolutionary communist, that what pretends to be the left today is our enemy? As it was in the 60s.
Look, I don't share your perspective, but I agree. My disagreements with the Greens is that they don't go far enough. I do believe in the climate science about global warming, and I do believe in many of the issues they take up, but there are some issues that they take up that I don't think are the main game. But, you know, I have differences with you over a number of causes in terms of how we view the Middle East, how we view the United States' role in the world. I haven't changed my attitudes towards US imperialism. I still hold the same views about America's perfidious role in the world today. As far as your comment about the Greens, I'm critical of them, and I would never join them, but I prefer them to the other parties, that's for sure.
Some more questions. I think we've got a gentleman.
Well, these are my good friends from former times when we were at La Trobe, although I kind of left at the end of 1970. But I just wanted to say a few things. One of the differences we had were because I was drifting towards, I was more of a new leftist, drifting towards kind of fourth international Trotskyism. But I remember arguing with you, Fergus, trying to persuade you not to be too much of an acolyte of Mao. But I don't want to focus on this because I think tonight is very important to kind of reminisce about what we were facing. And I remember, I think it was before the first march we had to Northland, I was posting some posters with Ian Coulter, who you probably remember. And we were in the car park at Glen College, and I remember suddenly saying to Ian, "Did you hear some shots?" And we were being actually shot at by the security guards around La Trobe. I remember going to, I think you probably were there, to Jen Shepper's room, and Jen was crying uncontrollably, saying that she just heard a bullet go past. Now, I think, you know, for me, I came from Poland when ideas prior to going to La Trobe, and I remember being given Australian citizenship at the age of 16, and 2 years later being called to go to the Australian army to fight in Vietnam. And I remember thinking, oh my God, my mum was in a Nazi concentration camp in Auschwitz, and my dad fought the Nazis. And I, looking at stuff on television, I remember I saw...
If you've got a question, we really need a question.
Anyway, the question, I suppose, is, I think we should all be very proud in what we did during that period in opposing the horrible repression. And I think, you know, I still continue doing the things that I did, and I hope everybody does here as well.
Thank you.
Because Australia certainly needs radicalisation.
I'll take that as a comment, not a question. But are there some more questions from the back of the room? Has anyone got a question? I want to ask.
Can I make a quick comment on what the questioner down there asked? Just very quickly, just to say, I think the political culture has moved enormously to the right, and it's one of the great mysteries for me, having been through that period when there was a mass movement and we were talking about revolutionary change, studying Marxism, arguing, debating with people as to how we've ended up in a situation where what I think is a reactionary right-wing political philosophical tradition of the Greens can be seen as left-wing. I think it's because we have moved so far to the right, and there's the great mystery for me is why, how has there been such a vacuum that has been filled by people who are so anti-American that they're even pro-Assad objectively. I mean, there's a problem there. That's a repetition of what happened in the 1930s with some people who were so anti-British imperialism that they ended up supporting fascism from a supposedly anti-imperialist point of view. So I do endorse and agree broadly with what the questioner said. That's my take on it.
We've got, and there's a couple of more questions. I think we're up here.
Hi, my name's Olivia. I have a question about the role of women. The three of you on the stage are all men, and all of the questions / extended statements from the audience so far have been from men. So I'm kind of interested, at that time, was the student movement, just especially the leadership roles, was it just dominated by men? What did women do?
Look, I think that's a good...
You can ask a question.
Yeah. Look, I think that's a good question. Men at La Trobe University, in terms of people who spoke at meetings publicly, they tended to be men. The women were strongly involved in politics, though. There was a socialist women's group. At Monash University, I think the women were more involved at leadership levels.
President and Secretary of the Labor
Yeah, I think they set a better example. The feminist movement was quite different to the way it is now. The women were socialists. I mean, what's happened to the feminist movement, I think many of us just raise our eyebrows, the corporatisation of feminism, that there's more CEOs who are women, or women want to join the army so that they can shoot people in third world countries. The women then were revolutionaries. Now, we tended to dominate, and that's probably our chauvinism, but the women's liberation movement was very strong.
The question really should be not about the women's liberation movement, but why were the women at La Trobe 40 years later invisible? Why were the women at La Trobe invisible?
Invisible.
By that question, do you mean why were the women who were involved in the movement invisible?
What were the women doing, Fergus?
Look, we have to call a spade here. What's popularly called the New Left was a very sexist, male chauvinist movement, as well as being revolutionary. Now, what male revolutionaries, socialists, did in regards to women at La Trobe, I think was a disgrace.
It wasn't
It was sexist.
Katie?
Well,
Hold on, no.
You have to clearly understand that.
That's an
right?
I don't think it's just at La Trobe that would have been true. And if you want to think about one of the enduring legacies of this period, it's actually the women's liberation movement that came out of it. And one of the kind of founding forces of the women's liberation movement was the treatment that many radical women experienced in their relationships with the men involved in the student movement. And their argument was, you might talk about imperialism and oppression in Vietnam. What are you doing in your relationship? What are you doing in your home? The personal is political, and that was their cry. And the revolution begins at home, and it begins in the bedroom. And so it's a very important question that's been asked, and I think it's important to remember that the women's liberation and indeed the gay liberation were some of the two enduring legacies of the time.
I think with the women that's true. The women's liberation movement, which I fully supported, was definitely a product of that time and something that continued, one of the greatest phenomenon of the second half of the 20th century, in my opinion. But don't forget, what fuelled the mass movement wasn't just the Vietnam War, but the fact that we had conscription for that war. That was really what fuelled it, the conscription element that made it a mass movement. Women didn't have to register. For men, it was we had to work out the life and death and the moral issue and the political
Women's
issue.
sons did.
And so naturally, I think that partly explains it. But of course, Women's Lib at La Trobe, I think, started in 1970 with leaflets and so on. As a Brunswick boy, like Brunswick boys are the biggest mummers boys you can find anywhere in the world, and I used to actually drive my mother to Women's Lib meetings at La Trobe. She used to say, I wish I was born later so that I could have had the advantage of Women's Lib. But then at one meeting they started talking about orgasms, and she said, I don't want to go back to that.
Have we got a few more questions before we have to head out the back? And you continue the conversation in each other's company in the atrium and enjoy a drink, and no doubt there'll be some hellos to be had as well. We have a question over here.
My name's Fiona McKenzie. I've been in Asia for the last 6 years, and I've been in Myanmar, so I have an interest in a country where there's been a lot of impact from a socialist governmental background. But my question is quite different. Do you have an expectation that ASIO would be here at this event, and what sort of interest do you think?
Put your hands up.
What sort of interest?
Imagine if you could all bring your files along. We could just have an open reading. Wouldn't that be fun?
Well, it's a point of curiosity for me because I've had an interest in a country where that kind of surveillance is a very, very prevalent social experience for people and a very negative social experience for people. So it's something that's been mentioned in this context, So for the people who are panellists, but also there's a number of people who've been quite engaged in, obviously, in the history of this protest movement who are here as audience members. Do you think that there would still be an interest for the people who are panellists?
Can I reframe that question? Do you reckon, Brian, for instance, I'll throw it to Brian, do you still think that you still are, in some ways, a person of interest to...
Reading through the scandal sheet again this afternoon, it was patently obvious to me that how closely 45 years ago I was followed around by ASIO and by NCC operatives. Make no mistake, this meeting tonight is being recorded, not only by the university, but it's also being noted in Canberra. In what ways that's happening, I don't know, we don't know, but it's noted. The presence of certain luminaries from Monash or La Trobe, it's noted. In response to what you said before, Albert, about Monash's view of the La Trobe Maoists, they were accused of being left-wing adventurists. And that's probably true. We were, or probably you two were, but
Splitters already.
But to some extent, I was too, because I was fiercely libertarian and bohemian and deeply a cultural revolutionary as well. Still am. It's very powerful. Very, very powerful. Perhaps more powerful than Maoism or socialism itself, because it's so deep. So deep.
Have we got any more questions? I think we've got a question over here.
My name's Joe, and I just wanted to make the point that I think that, the point was made before that we are living in a very right-wing society, and we are, there's no doubt about that, but there has been significant changes that have occurred, and they're here for good, and they're better changes. And you guys and girls, and women, sorry, were the forerunners of that, and I really think we owe you a great gratitude of debt, both male and female, for all of those people who participated and did put their hand up at the time.
Thank you for your comment. I think there was another question over here.
Thanks. My name's Paul. Just a general question. Is there a radical left on campuses in general today? If so, how's it being demonstrated? If not, why isn't it being demonstrated? What message do you have to broad-minded students who care about the society that they live in?
Let me just direct that to Katie first about the nature of contemporary universities, and then get the message from our guests here. Universities changed so dramatically. It's become very vocationally driven. It's almost a functional experience now. People pay for their education in a way in order to get a qualification that will provide them employment. It isn't the all-encompassing cultural experience that many people in this room have felt. Has shaped their lives the way it used to be. Does politics live on campus? Does it have a home on campus anymore?
I think one of the other legacies of the student radicalism of the 60s and 70s is that consecutive Conservative governments in the 90s actually deliberately defunded student clubs on campus, seeing them as the breeding ground, really, of the radical left.
Well, they weren't wrong, were they?
Indeed, and the implications of that for university life have been really profound. It's not the only thing that's changed university life, but when you don't fund student clubs, there's no cause to gather together on campus, to meet, to have an active body politic, if you like. There is political action on campus. I see students putting up, what we might call the radical left leaflets. They've got a very, very small following. Students don't engage in politics in the way that certainly the people here would have done at university in the early 70s and late 60s. But for example, the divestment campaign that students ran at La Trobe a couple of years ago, they ran very effectively, pushing the university to commit to divesting from fossil fuels. So they pick their causes and they go for it, and sometimes they're very effective.
If you had a message, Fergus, to young people today on campus?
Look, I think it's almost impossible to replicate the experience we had in the late 60s, early 70s today, and I think there's a number of factors. I think having a small campus with a homogeneous population created the possibility to have a mass democracy, and I don't believe it's possible to have a mass democracy on decentralised campuses with thousands of students. And the other factor is that campuses are multicultural, and there's many, many students from all around the world, in particularly Asian countries and India. I don't believe they would be prepared to make those kinds of sacrifices in struggles, and I say that tongue in the cheek, I'm sure they wouldn't. They haven't come to the university to get engaged in mass struggles over issues that are happening in Australia. And that's a major dilution factor. Now, I'm not saying it was deliberate, but I think it's undermined the possibility of having an uprising. There's quite a difference between having student activism, handfuls of students fighting over a particular issue, and having the whole campus involved in a mass struggle. I don't believe that can happen again, sadly, unless the world changes.
Well, it's time for us to thank all our panellists, but I want to do this the way that you might have run this back in one of your meetings. Now, we have the option of retiring to a room out the back there and enjoying a few drinks and some refreshments on behalf of La Trobe University, but I don't want to enforce anyone to go that doesn't want to go, Barry. So how do we do this? How do we have a bit of direct democracy? Move a motion for me.
The first thing we'd need is... I think we'd need for and against, and that was something that was very much part of what we did. A conflict-driven debate culture that allowed truth to be sorted.
So we have to find a speaker against the idea of retiring to the next room and having a drink and some...
I propose that we have a sit-in in this hall now in view of La Trobe being a thoroughly reactionary institution we do not wish to have.
Nothing's changed. Thank you for coming on. Before you go, I've got to tell you about some other events that are coming up, and we've got to thank our guests as well. But the next lecture here in the Bold Thinking series is happening in October, and it's here at the Sofitel Melbourne on Collins at the Trobe University's Bold Thinking series. It's the Arthur Street Auditorium there, and it will be Kevin Rudd and a panel of people talking about the rise of the influence of China in an age of the increasing power and increasing military adventurism from the Chinese as well. So that'll be a fascinating conversation. That's happening on the 26th of October, Thursday the 26th of October. It's a lunchtime event, 12:15 p.m. Go to the La Trobe Bold Thinking website and find the details there if that is of interest to you. And then in November, a really fascinating discussion on the future of La Trobe University and reflecting back on the 50th anniversary of the university, and alumni Virginia Trioli, one of my colleagues, will be leading a discussion about life at La Trobe then and what the future of universities will be into the future. Can you please thank our guests for coming and telling their stories tonight? To Brian, to Barry, to Fergus, to Katie, thank you for coming. And as we've moved the motion, on you go.